Welcome to the Pastors Podcast. It's Pastor Scott with Pastors Jim and Brian.
Hello.
Hello.
This is it's been like a week and a half. That's why we're making sure to have this podcast. It was like a week and a half before that. So sorry for those of you who are, expecting every Tuesday the Pastors Podcast to just keep your week going.
The giant hole we've left in your life.
I'll be honest with you. I got a total of 0 angry emails every time we slow down the process of these coming out. So
Must be a glitch in the internet. I'm sure they're out there just piling up.
if only the internet just would regularly glitch angry emails.
Yes, that would be.
I just think everybody. I'm not even saying personally. I just mean like
Yeah.
for everybody. I think everybody in their whatever their sphere or life is if they like just the internet just filtered out half of the angry emails, I think the world would be a better place.
I kind of wanted to filter out the less literary ones, the less people whose vocabulary is a little more limited, and those who have a richer vocabulary. That might be kind of interesting to
Even if it's angry, it's still kind of strangely enjoyable to read.
Something like that. I've never been called that before.
I didn't know that word could be used as an insult. It's amazing. I think as a pastor, we don't get very many insulting emails, though. I'm thankful for that. Like if you were a school board member, you'd get insulting emails.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Like if you were a
Politician?
you'd get insulting.
Yeah,
emails.
I'd probably get more than
As pastors, we don't get insult. I mean,
I wouldn't say
we
never.
don't.
I can't.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. Okay.
Yeah.
Pastors do
Yes.
receive them, I'm sure, but I don't remember receiving an insulting email.
No.
Yes.
Welcome again to the Pastors Podcast. Here we are. Here we are. So in the next couple of weeks, we've got a few things coming up. We're going to talk about a upcoming family meeting in the next episode, and so you're going to want to hear about that.
Yes.
After that, I'm taking a microphone to Uganda.
Oh,
and
cool.
hoping to record a podcast there. And we'll see how that goes. So not over Zoom, but actually in person with some of our partners at ARU. Few cool and exciting things coming up. But this episode, I'm kind of just riffing until I figure out what this episode is about. This episode was an opportunity to, on a Monday morning, grab Brian, grab Jim, give you a little bit of a light into the things that we talk about and try to figure out as we're navigating through things. I do want to, the last couple of weeks we've started Galatians. I do want to hear a little bit from you, Brian, about why Galatians, and what excites you most about this series that we've started. I think you had an opportunity. You've had an opportunity to preach the last 2 Sundays, and so in some senses you explained that, but you're also just kind of walking through these specific texts. I've gotten increasingly excited just hearing you in the background planning and kind of the direction of this sermon series as a whole. And so I thought this might be a cool context to have you explain a little bit more broadly why we picked this in the first place and kind of why now.
Yeah, Galatians is a great book. Part of the reason we picked it is we'd spent, and this is a kind of a bit of a window into how we do this. So, we had spent, several months on a topical series. We're kind of jumping from book to book and passage to passage. And that's not how we want to, that's not a problem, but it's not how we want to spend like all of our time, on Sundays. And so going through a book kind of line by line, it sort of, it forces you to not stick to hobby horses. It forces you to kind of like, stay honest. You have to go through every kind of piece of a book, and you get to see how the whole thing hangs together. You get to kind of think the thoughts of that book after it. And so we knew we wanted to do a book. And then Galatians in particular, I think it does this really cool thing right now, where on the one hand, Galatians is kind of it's got a basics vibe to it. It's got a like, hey, here's the gospel. Here's like the thing that you need to know. Here's the center of things. And here's how that kind of continues on into, the rest of your Christian life, whether you've been a Christian for 3 days or 3 decades. This is something that is going to be central to you, and exploring that has a way of resetting you. It has a way of grounding you. And I think for us, in some ways, coming out of COVID and a lot of other things going on, you kind of have this way of going, okay, being brought back to basics in a way that doesn't feel basic is a really great thing right now. Like, I know for me, that's been a bit of a surprise over the last couple of weeks preaching, is like, this feels like stuff that in one sense is simple, I guess. But boy, has it felt refreshing to do something like that, to go back to the well. And so in one sense, it's that's why Galatians. In another sense, a little more kind of relevant or topical, the book is in many ways about justification. We'll get to that word pretty soon. And we tend to think about that mainly in religious terms. So, justified before God, what makes you able to stand before God, what makes you someone who can be in God's presence and not out of God's presence, what justifies you. And that sounds very religious, but I think I think I mentioned this in a sermon somewhat recently, but I didn't get to really develop it. I mean, it was like 10 years ago when everyone was saying, less than that, when everyone was walking around LA and probably America in a lot of ways saying like, I'm so glad that your truth works for you and my truth works for me. And, and that was the big problem, was like, everyone's talking about their truth this and their truth that. And in like 7 years, all of a sudden, if you don't have the right opinion on the right event that happened like yesterday or this morning, expressed in the right way, you're a horrible human being. What happened to my truth? It's just out the window. And so all of a sudden we find ourselves in this kind of whirlwind where we're constantly having to justify ourselves to other people. And that bleeds into our own mind. So what ends up happening is you now begin to view yourself as someone who's walking around a world constantly having to be justified, to prove that you're worthwhile, to prove that you're the right kind of person and the wrong kind of person. So it's this really weird thing where you internalize this need to justify yourself in front of other people. And so even if you're not posting weird opinions on social media or talking really strongly about these, beliefs that are approved or not approved, depending on who you're hanging out with, at the office or something, you're still thinking through that lens as you go through your day. You're thinking about what you're thinking, what you're doing, how you're talking. There's this kind of camera looking back at you with the voices and the opinions of thousands of other people, and you're filtering your whole life through that now. So really, like, that's true in one sense across all of human history. It feels really focused right now. And so we end up in this place where we need an understanding of how justification works because we're doing it every day. And so to have the gospel come in as what justifies you, and to have God be the one whom you're justified before, and to have that be something secure and not variable, like stable and not unstable, becomes really important just to like living life in America and Los Angeles, like right now. So you put those two things together, this kind of sense, in one sense, it's the basics. In another sense, it's just really, really topical and really pertinent to like what feels like our kind of moment. And those go hand in glove. And so it feels like what a great chance to explore that, and hopefully leave us breathing a little easier and feeling more stable, both kind of in that long-term sense, and all humans need that, and also kind of walking through this moment now.
It's so helpful, so encouraging. I think part of why I'm so excited for what lies ahead. Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Thoughts?
That's right. When you think about the book of Galatians, when you just, whether it's in the angle that Brian just said, or when just from your experience with it, what stands out to you, either in passages or even just in a sense?
I've never liked the book of Galatians, to be perfectly honest.
This is excellent.
Love it.
Yeah.
Why not?
I haven't looked at it lately, but I'm going through it. Of course, as Brian's doing a wonderful job of opening up in a whole new way. So I'm taking madly notes about everything. We're trying to write down every word he says. But I think when I've tried to teach it a couple of 3 times, I didn't have the insight that you've got, and it was just like a struggle to figure out what what's going on in this book? What is Paul saying to these people? And I think that is not unusual. I think it's somewhat of a book. If you don't have an insight, if you don't have a way of coming into it expecting something, then you're not going to quite get out of it what is being presented right now. And anybody who's got any care about their faith needs to be pulling up these messages and listening to them, because they're very, very powerful. And I think this is probably the best teaching I've heard on Galatians. So I kind of sidestepped your question, but it's my advertisement.
No, what excites you is that you haven't historically been excited. And I think what I appreciate about, I always appreciate about your honesty, Jim, is
that's why I have trouble getting a job.
In order to justify myself, if I were asked that question, I would feel the pressure to make up something that excited me. And there's a rootedness, and not just at this point in life, but there's a rootedness in the gospel in you, Jim, that frees you to, because I think why that's so helpful is I think there's a lot of us that feel that way about all sorts of different parts of Scripture.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? Depending on our experience with it, our level of familiarity with it, I think that we would all probably, if we're really honest, acknowledge that, there's parts of Scripture that I'm not nuts about. I don't totally understand. Like, why is this there, or what's God trying to do?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I'm going through 1st and 2nd Timothy right now with a group of people who they just can't get it. They can't follow. They can't figure out what's going on. Probably some of it is my teaching, but some of it, I think it's just really, our culture is I think, somewhat impenetrable at the moment from the point of view of the reality of God and the revolutionary understanding of life with the advent of Jesus. It just doesn't play. And I think it's very difficult to get from A to Z sometimes, but it is for this group, and it's fascinating to sit there and listen to them take what I just said and totally change directions with it and go somewhere else. I'm like, what? I didn't say that. So I think that I don't think it's uncommon. I think this teaching is uncommon, and it's uncommonly clear, but that doesn't mean that people are able to, if your window is dirty on the inside, you're not going to be able to see it just because it's clear on the outside.
Huh. So you talked, Brian, a little bit about, I don't think it was one of the last 2 weeks, you talked a little bit about, in a sense, the role of Galatians in church history, right? How it has, in a number of different ways, been a pivotal book in some of the most dramatic transformations and moments in church history. Going further back to the church in Galatia itself, as you've read and dug in and tried to wrap your hands around what's going on here, why Paul's so obviously upset kind of on the front end, what is it about the context of the church in Galatia that stands out to you as we come to kind of understand and really grasp what is going on in Paul's heart as he writes this?
Yeah, so what's interesting is this is a book written to the churches in Galatia, which is sort of interesting. It's not like the church in Corinth, which is typically Paul, oftentimes will write the church in. So and that has brought up like hundreds and thousands of pages of commentary on, okay, so is it the churches in northern Galatia? Is it in southern Galatia? How does it line up with these different timelines and questions of when Paul visited Jerusalem? And like, we're actually going to get to that in a couple weeks on, Paul's visit to the other apostles, and how does this all kind of work together? And so there's a way in which sometimes you get, especially in like modern kind of commentaries and scholarship, you get caught up in answering some of these somewhat technical debates. And those debates, while they are important and definitely have their place and can have some kind of influence over how you understand the book, they don't really do anything substantive to the text itself. So one of the things that I've actually found that's really interesting is that's different than asking about, the church in Corinth. How does that context set up the book of 1 Corinthians? Like, well, there's a bunch of crazy stuff going on in Corinth. And like that kind of sets the book up because Paul is going directly at it. Here, it's less about the location and the churches themselves. It really is about these people who seem to be somewhat pervasive in the New Testament world, who seem to be Jewish Christians who are going around saying, hey, Paul in particular just didn't give you the whole story. He really only gave you a little piece. They'd probably say more than that. And again, you're reconstructing in some ways from what Paul's saying, which, so you got to be a little careful. You don't want to put words in their mouth. You want to do what's fair to them and what Paul says and not what you kind of are extrapolating from. But it really, they're talking about things like circumcision, things like really important Old Testament commandments. They're essentially saying that, this church, which seems to be a somewhat young church, again, that depends on north or south and all that stuff, but it seems somewhat young. They're just struggling because these people are saying there's more and better than what Paul gave you, but it comes through this way of being a part of God's people. It comes through this way of sort of justifying yourself before God. And so you see that's the key thing. And that's where I think the book kind of unlocks there, because you begin to look around and go, that's not just a question of how am I saved, though it definitely is that. It's also not just a question of how am I like included in the church, though it definitely is that in some ways as well. How do you take those things apart? It really is a question of what does it mean for a human being to be the right kind of human being? And that like brings all those things together. It ties in our relationship before God. And what Paul's going to say is that you're going to have to source that from outside of yourself. Like you cannot source being the right kind of human being from inside of yourself. So you really have to source that from the gospel and from what God has done for you. And then you're going to be able to, living in that, pursue change and growth and movement towards how God has designed us to be and how he's designed your individual life to be. All those good works in Ephesians that he's prepared beforehand that we walk in them. But you really have to source it outside of yourself before you can look to yourself. And that seems to be the big context there. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been so powerful throughout church history, is there really is always a way we're doing that. There's always a way that you're finding yourself going, okay, so am I going to do this outside myself or inside myself? And it takes different forms in different times. But from the Galatians to the Reformation to the First Great Awakening, in different ways, you're seeing that same common human problem. What makes me worthwhile? What makes me a good human being? What puts me on the right side of things? What allows me to trust that I'm the right kind of person and that I'm living my life right and that and all of those things. And there's different ways that history has told us, well, just do this, do that, do this, do that. And that's how you prove it. And Paul comes in with this really resounding, no, it really is grace and peace from. And so if that's the case, then you're going to find yourself, if you're trapped in a kind of grace and peace if mentality, whatever that looks like, whether it's the year 100 or the year 2020 or something in between, you're going to feel trapped in it, and getting this book's going to give you a sense of freedom from that. It's in other books too, but this one just really kind of punches it right on the nose. And so I think that's where the context really helps. It's not so much the church itself as these people who have come in, and Paul dealing with them pretty directly and pretty strongly gives you a sense of, well, that's how strong it must need to be in my life too. And maybe the power that they can come in and change my life and continue to change it such that I actually am transforming even while I'm sourcing my worth from something outside of myself.
I think that's so helpful. And I think it also even gives some context to why, in a sense, our introduction to the series was less like a bunch of historical facts and datum context and more kind of a philosophical context. Like what was the thinking going on and how is that thinking echoed in what we're doing today? I was struck even as you're talking about, like, I think that our world today, and I think we imbibe this, we've convinced ourselves that we're asking more, oh, dang it.
You had it and you lost it, huh?
I did. I had a great word.
I saw it in your eyes.
I had a great word. Oh.
It's because I talked to you long.
Just like that. You were holding it. You did. I was holding it. And I was like, will he just
You didn't write it down.
Stop. No. It wasn't that great of a word. Sophisticated was the word. No, but like we've convinced ourselves that we are asking more sophisticated questions.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
We've convinced ourselves that today we are so advanced. We are so in another level that we are asking more sophisticated questions, and therefore we need this new knowledge that wasn't there before. And at the core, when you peel away this sophisticated facade, what a book like Galatians and the story of history shows us is that we're actually just still asking the same questions. We're asking these same basic questions about identity, about justification, the same fears, the same social dynamics that have been at work throughout history is what we're going through right now. And the facade of sophistication to it kind of offers the interpretation that, well, no, you need new answers because these are wholly new questions, when in reality, they're not. And in some ways, actually, we're asking them in less sophisticated ways than they were even asked historically. Yeah.
Can I go back to the word designed that
Please.
you mentioned a while ago?
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's a common, in our culture, a common understanding. But I think it's essential to knowing who we are biblically. Can you? Open that up a little bit?
I mean, I can try. I think you're right. So what's weird about right now, there's a sense in which sort of culturally, if we're talking Western culture or just Los Angeles, there's a way we have a leg up in a lot of areas. I mean, I think there's a way that we do consider equality. We consider the idea of fairness. We actually have some sense of regard for people who are weak in ways it's just foreign to a lot of human history, especially in like, the West, in like you cycle time back, 1,000, 2,000 years. That just wasn't the case, and a lot of that, I mean, if you ever pick up Tom Holland's book Dominion, you find out he's not a Christian, but he argues that that's basically just a Christian hangover. Like Christianity did that, so that's kind of interesting. But we do have this. There's parts of our culture that I think are really, really helpful, and ways in which there is an advancement. There's a kind of sense that, however you want to play it out, that we want to have regard for all different kinds of people, and that's a helpful thing. Because that was so absent if you read things from like, Rome or Greece, yes, or like just so fundamentally absent. Power was power, and if you had it, you used it, and it's just no one thought twice about it. I say that because there's a way in which you want to paint our culture just entirely backwards. Like not you guys, but like in general, is a temptation. No, totally. There's ways that our culture can do has advanced pieces to it, parts that we do think a lot about that I think are helpful parts. There's also ways in which we're really stunted, and one of them is like the idea of design, or the idea that there's an old. This is kind of Aristotle basically, and before a little bit too. But what makes a knife a good knife? You really have no idea until you know what a knife's for. Mm-hmm. It's an impossible question to answer. That's not a hard concept to grasp. But when you look around, what is a person for? What is a nation for? What is a family for? What is a school for? You can go the list of all the major things, institutions, people, categories we have, and all the conversations have zero sense of, well, here's what they're for. And so we really are just arguing, just philosophically, like malnourished, and I get that that's a hard question. It's not an easy question to answer, but it seems like a really necessary question before we just assert a bunch of different definitions and then yell at each other about them without talking about that. And so when we talk about a human being and the book of Galatians and the Bible and scripture and the Christian faith and tradition, you have a certain idea of what a human being is for. They're to glorify God. They're to enjoy him forever. They are not their own, but belong body and soul to God through Christ. Like there's ways that what you are for, that there's a design to you that has a purpose to it and a direction to it and a kind of a trajectory that is grounded in something outside of yourself. That even the concept of identity, which is really new language.
Yes.
Like we talked about identity ideas before in some ways, but the idea of identity is really new and really vague. Your identity can be something that you either, you can use the same word to talk about what's stable about you or what's changeable about you. Your identity is the thing that keeps you the same throughout all the changes, or the thing that you change that asserts that, and that's who you are, is that you can change it. So the fact that you can do that, in the opposites mean use the same word, that's difficult. And we also, you can mean all sorts of things on top of that. But that same word, you're trying to say, okay, what is it exactly that allows me to be, what trajectory am I on? What is it that's pushing me in a direction? The Christian faith is going to say your identity is sourced, it's housed, it's given coherence and stability outside of you. That's why it holds together, is because we're people who are made in the image of God. And so if you start there, you realize that's going to have a built-in trajectory. And so you get back to really philosophical things. Aristotle had 4 causes that describe things. Not just the thing that pushed one billiard ball into the next one. That later David Hume would say doesn't work at all, and there's all these arguments about this in the philosophical world. But it's really helpful to think about. Okay, there's the thing that you're made up of. There's the thing that puts you in a certain form, that takes that material and arranges it. There's the place that came from. There's a place that goes to. There's the purpose behind that. And so that's just a really interesting way of thinking about a person. And we've basically said, well, now we're just going to talk about none of those things except the billiard balls, Yeah. And so design becomes this thing that we probably should have been thinking about, but we just haven't been. And so it feels revolutionary when it's actually kind of simple. The thing that makes it beautiful and complex and, stunning and wonderful is that your design is given to you from someone else. And so you're living into something that someone else designed for you, and that someone else is bigger than you and knows more than you and loves you more than you love yourself. And so all of a sudden, sourcing your identity somewhere else becomes the greatest thing in the world. Because imagine just being left to yourself, and you have to do that on your own. So long answer, but there's a lot to unpack there. And I think that culturally retrieving some of that and restoring it and thinking more about purpose and how that relates to what we are and ought to be, it just becomes really freeing. I don't know, that was a lot of different stuff, but there's
that was powerful.
There's the unpack.
Yeah. There's the whole idea of self-awareness. I think is, if you think about it for a while, is shocking that I'm aware of who I am, and that there's certain proclivities I have, and certain things that seem to really pull on me, like. I can see my dog do the same thing. That seems like more not. I'm aware of it, but it's not something I feel like it's so easily changeable. But there are other things that I realize I can change. I can think differently. I can have a different sense of myself. I can make choices that will enhance something, maybe my physical ability, but may detract from something else, and begin to make all these choices. And somewhere in there, it seems to me, I begin to think about, well, who is the me in the middle of all this? What actually am I in here? And maybe that's too either stupid or too far out there. But I think that's something that when you come to faith, Christian faith particularly, you can address, because I think there is something in me that is the essence of me, and that sounds too Buddhist, I think, somehow, but I don't mean it to be the way. But it was stunning to me when I first came to faith, begin to think, oh, that's why I'm self-aware, so that I know that I am a created, thoughtfully created being. Stunning, I think. That was to me a stunning thing.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The phrase you used, Brian, was simple and revolutionary.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that in this moment, in this this is part of why I am so excited to be alive right now. So excited to be serving the Lord in the church, in the city, in Los Angeles. And, I think there's an attitude that can be like, things are so horrible, and things are so hard, and you're in Los Angeles. Anybody who doesn't live here, right? Why? And for all those reasons, it is so exciting to me to be here in this moment, in a sense, in this moment in history, with the reality, the message that is simple and revolutionary, that makes sense of all the questions that, in one sense, all the questions that people are asking, and in another sense, all the questions that are behind all the angst and tensions people are feeling. And what a rich and sweet opportunity, privilege, it is to get to be here, to do this, to walk through Galatians in a place like this.
It's funny because you have, you're right. It's simple, revolutionary. And then you have Jim and I over here for the last 15 minutes, which is 95% Brian. But I mean, we're heading into this really intriguing. I mean, it's intriguing to me. Like, there's some deep stuff going on, some really complicated things, about like, what is the I, in the center of all of this? What is this thing that I call myself? Like, these are really philosophical questions. And I've got in the back of my head, like, David Hume calling it a bundle of perceptions. You really don't know. There's really nothing there at all. Yep. I think, therefore I am. Well, what's that I? It's nothing. Yep. It's just a bunch of things you experience. And to find that the same thing that strikes the simple tone and makes it revolutionary, which is this sense that you source your identity. We'll use that word. You source it from outside of yourself. Is the same thing that answers these really kind of ridiculously complex and navel-gazing philosophical questions that we tend to come up with about what gives your I any sense of stability at all.
Yeah.
And the more you look inward apart from God, the more that completely unravels. That's the history of Western philosophy in a lot of ways, at least parts of it. And so to watch the same thing be both the simple answer and dive into the complexity of all sorts of crazy thoughts and be able to address those too. That's what blows my mind, is that there's this kind of thing. I can't remember who it was. Someone in church history said, essentially the truth. And it's in the Caveman's Call song too, from back in the day. But the truth is, it's like a river or a lake where the strong can swim all the way down to these crazy depths, and the weak and the broken can just walk across it. But it's the same river, it's the same lake.
Yeah.
And I think there's a beautiful picture to me of, and that's in some ways, that's the whole Bible. It's also Galatians.
Yeah.
It's the whole Bible, is that the same thing that someone like me is going to spin out in a million different intellectual directions and then try and stop that so I can preach on Sunday, is going to be the thing that someone who, has a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa who has never learned how to read, is going to be the thing that meets him in his struggle and need as he reflects on himself and his life circumstances and situations. Same thing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful and it's wonderful. And of course, how could you not need that in kind of every corner of your life?
Yeah. All right. So as the two of you think about, sit kind of here in this, in a sense, in this moment, both entering into the book of Galatians, entering into this season. I mean, we could talk about the cultural contexts and the last 2 years or whatever. And as you sit here in Los Angeles and at Cornerstone, thinking about all that the Lord's doing and what he has ahead, what intrigues and excites you most about what lies ahead?
Okay, Brian.
I want to hear Jim talk for a while. I think we should have a podcast with just Jim talking personally, but
story time with Pastor Jim.
Okay, I don't have a set thought about it, but
I know. That's what this is. That's what this is. Yeah.
The issue for...
We won't hold you to it.
Okay, all right. I'll hold me to it, but that'll be maybe Dora. So let me just talk. So over a long period of time, I have, from the point of view of a church, from point of view of one who is supposed to be giving out this message about this ancient Jesus person, to a culture that's totally pretty much oblivious and totally uninterested. I think I've seen a sea change, and that fascinates me because I didn't expect that. I expected somehow that we were all kind of we'd go along on the same trip, like we're mostly self-interested. We're mostly trying to figure out what to do today, how to fix tomorrow, make it more secure or something like that, how to get people to love me without me having to love them too much back. And it has changed. I think it's ramped up somehow, and it has a different look. It feels more selfish and less and self-serving and less kind of open and generous in a kind of maybe a facade kind of way. That's just a Los Angeles culture. But speaking into that culture and also just having looked through the history of this particular church since way back, and the way that the area has changed and the whole sense of the metropolis that we're in has changed. I find it to be very exciting. It seems like there's both a sense of focus that's totally closed to any idea of a God or anything else like that. But there's another sense in which there's a realization of a kind of vulnerability of myself that I think invites God in. I need something. I need some kind of. I can't do this. I can't do this on my own. I need somebody. Something has to happen, and that kind of desperateness, I think, invites a conversation about the reality of God, the definition of who we are that we've just been talking about. So what I find is that these times are, I think, far more exciting. The last time that seemed to happen, I think, was post-World War II, where a whole lot of cultural change and shifting happened. And I think that was a time where the message thrived, and then it got kind of pushed to the side, and now it's thriving. And I think that's kind of like the waves of an ocean coming and going. And we just take these first 4 words, and in the beginning, God, and start with that and say, holy cow, that's in itself a stunning thing to say. Because if that's true, everything else is kind of false in a certain kind of no longer important way. So that's what my random thoughts at the moment. What little biological brain I have left is saying.
See, we need the Jim podcast.
We do.
I tell you.
We do.
I think that's right. I mean, I think, in the Book of Common Prayer, they have this refrain. They source everything from Scripture in the Book of Common Prayer, which is kind of funny because you don't notice that. They don't reference it, but almost everything, you start reading through the Psalms and go, oh, that's where that came from. Yeah. One of the things that you say regularly, it has a name, maybe it's not the Gloria Patri, there's like a Latin name for it, but you say, glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, and you say it a few times. You say it after you read some Psalms and different things, and so you begin to memorize it. And what you're saying, Jim, is that's why I'm excited too in a lot of ways right now, is there's in that you have simultaneously this sense of the expansive scope of eternity, as it was in the beginning, world without end, forever shall be. And it's the Father, Son, and Spirit. It's the triune God. And the whole gospel is wrapped up in the Trinity. It's wrapped up in, God sent, the Father sends the Son by the Spirit. But then there's this really, right in the middle, like smack dab in the middle, there's this is now, as it was in the beginning, is now and ever shall be. And so you kind of have this combination, as you say these things, of this incredible stability, this, the same yesterday, today, and forever, across time and space. We think of our lives as long, and they're tiny, they're short, blades of grass in the Bible, they rise for a moment, they wither at the end of the day. For God, 1,000 years is like a day. There's just ways in which we just really think we have a long time, we have a short time. It melts into the scope of history and eternity, and yet is now. Glory to the Father, as it was in the beginning, is now. And right at this moment, we find ourselves in the is now of that glory. And that's going to show up in ways that we probably can't expect, and in some ways that maybe we can forecast, but maybe not in the way we forecasted it. But what an exciting time. The now is always an exciting time, because the glory that is now is connected to the thing that was in the beginning and ever shall be, world without end. That's got to be exciting if you can take a step back and think about it kind of from that perspective. I personally have a hard time when I get lost in the minutia of the day. And so for that reason, saying that phrase a few times a day in different times of prayer is really helpful, because it does kind of anchor you and in something large and point you right back to the right now. Because ideally, the prayer I'm praying at that moment is a part of the glory being given to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit now.
It's interesting. There's a kind of a soul presence and a physical presence. The physical presence is, going and get the kids from school, bringing them home, they're getting groceries, fixing the flat tire. And the soul presence, I think, beats to a different drummer if you're careful about it and thinking about it. That's very powerful. And those two coexist somehow, and it's amazing to me because one can take over so easily, particularly at the first one, where I'm just running errands. And it's like, oh, this is life at its lowest level somehow. And if I lived in some countries, it would be, they'd look up and say, hey, you've got a car, you've got a grocery store, you've got everything's great. But it's still in some sense the same thing. It's stuff to do. And then there's this other sense in which you kind of feel your eternality before God, and something stunning is in the middle of this day, and that's, I think, it's easy to drift off to one, and sometimes it's hard to refocus and connect back to the other and realize the celebration that needs to be going on, and in that awareness.
Yeah, that part's stunning. I think there's something about the way that the Bible never talks about you having to create that reality. It talks about it in these just really kind of bold, simple, existing terms. It's present tense. You are seated with Christ in the heavenly places. Yeah. There's a way in which you don't have to manufacture spirituality. You really are you're along for the ride already. Eternity is imbued in these moments in which we live that seem so mundane, but they're caught up in something obviously much, much larger in existence itself. And so it's really just a question of, it's already happening. So you can sort of enjoy it, or you can kind of get distracted from it and miss it as it's happening all around you, but you're not making it. And so the idea that you can physically be present somewhere and your soul can be present before God at that same time, that you are seated in the heavenly places with Christ right now. Like that's as we talk, as these people, whoever's listening to this, as you guys are listening, that's a truth that exists for Christians. That just, yes. And so I find myself so often trying to manufacture excitement, spiritual excitement. I have to make this happen. So my actions are going to determine the existence of the spirituality in the world. Yeah. I have to kind of lay God's reality over the world I see as a kind of, a game I have to play. I have to make that happen when it was already there underneath all these things that are visible. And I just simply have to be there for it because I already am. I find that really helpful. And so often you are distracted, but just the potential of your soul being able to be before God, whatever that means, both metaphysically, but also whatever that means, in terms of your experience or practice of that, just being aware that your soul is before God as your body is before all these other tasks, and that He built it that way. He made those things united. He did that Himself in Christ. It's just some really amazing things that it's stunning to think that.
Yeah, it is. And I think what the New Testament says to me is every once in a while, God pokes at the sheets of the curtain, and enters in, even though you didn't particularly want Him to or expect that, in stunning ways, and in little ways, and in life, earth-changing ways. And it's just stunning. But he pokes in once in a while on His own and just changes everything.
Well, isn't that the problem? I mean, at some level, isn't it, we talk, I want to manufacture that spirituality. I want to do this thing. Yeah. And then God shows up and you realize how much you wanted Him not to be there.
Yeah.
And now the real business begins. Now the real formation and work on the heart and growth as a person begins between you and the God who's now there in a sense. He was always there.
Yeah.
But He asserts Himself in that way, and you go, oh man, I had this under control, and now I realize I don't.
Exactly. Yeah. That's well said.
Well, I think that gives us both a lot to, in a lot of senses, look forward to, whether it's this season or every season, right? It reminds us of the current and pervasive reality of God, of His presence, of His work in different ways, of why we can be, in a sense, uniquely excited about what He's going to do as we dive into Galatians. And also with authenticity, be excited for what comes next, right? Not have to bear it in Galatians as if, that's that one only thing. So I think I think it's helpful. I think it's a lot of helpful reminders that people are going to have to listen to on 0.75 speed.
This is what happens when you get Brian and Jim on a Monday morning.
It is.
And you kind of have a loose outline.
100%.
This is what's going to happen.
100%. I knew what I was getting when I asked for it, but we're going to have to leave it there because we could keep going.
Yes, we could.
So thank you guys. Thanks for your love for us, for your people, for God's people, and for the truth in a way that helps us make sense of the seeming chaos around us that the Lord has so beautifully ordered and directed.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah. And thank you guys for listening. We love you, and we will see you on Sunday.